Up to 60% of physicians struggle with imposter syndrome. So odds are, if you're listening to this right now, you either struggle with this yourself or you know someone who does. Keep listening to learn how to stop feeling like a fraud. This is the Physician Philosopher Podcast. I'm Dr. Jimmy Turner, an anesthesiologist, online entrepreneur, and creator of the Alpha Coaching Experience. The Physician Philosopher Podcast teaches you how to create the life you deserve, one thought at a time. Start before you're ready. Start by starting. Start now. Hey, everyone. Welcome to episode number 75 of the Physician Philosopher Podcast, where we take an uncurated and unapologetic look into physician life, money, and mindset. So today's thought is this. If you feel like a fraud, remember that you are the hero of someone else's story. So I recently went to a mastermind event for the coaches that get trained at the Life Coach School. It's where I got my certification. This was in Austin, Texas. First time Kristen and I had ever been there. It was actually a really cool city. I'm not going to lie, driving up, I was not super impressed. But then staying there for a few days, I actually really like Austin. It's a pretty fun town. Found some really nice places to eat and to enjoy ourselves. And while I mainly went to go to that meeting to meet the other physician coaches, there was a talk by someone whose name is Rachel Hart that absolutely just destroyed me, hit me to the core. And I want to share with you what I learned from her talk, and also to expound upon some ideas that I've already shared on this show in previous episodes, because you, like me, may be listening to this podcast right now and suffer with imposter syndrome, or the phenomenon of thinking that despite all of your accomplishments, your accolades, your achievements, you feel like a fraud. You're just waiting to be caught. And I'm just going to normalize this for a minute and just say, me too. I suffer with imposter syndrome. I still can't believe that there are thousands of people that listen to this show each week, that there are doctors who trust us enough inside of ACE to let us coach them through their burnout and help them find personal and financial freedom so they can create a life they love. And, you know, a lot of my life really feels like I honestly don't deserve it. Even though, to be clear, I've put thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of work into this business. It just feels like at some point the world's going to catch up to me and say, hey, like a ton of bricks, like reality sets in, and all of a sudden everyone, figures out that I'm not as awesome as people think that I am. I'm not saying that you do as you're listening to this, but I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop for years, and to feel like I live a really, good lifestyle, to wake up from this dream and just wait for that shoe to drop. Something's got to go wrong at some point. And that's, I guess, discounting the tax bill. I just got the very large tax bill that I'm going to have to pay next week, which I was kind of surprised about. I'm not going to lie. And as someone who, espouses themselves as a personal finance nerd, a money nerd, that was surprising to me, and kicks off a little bit of my imposter syndrome in that space too. But looking back at the math, I wasn't taking out enough. So no big deal. That's what emergency funds are for. I did some math wrong. Turns out I'm not perfect. And, I constantly had this idea, though, and I'm going to be honest with you, that for most of my life that I'm not good enough. It's part of the reason why I have this external achievement thing going on. I often feel inadequate, not good enough. I feel like a fraud. And I bet that I'm not the only one that's listening to this right now that thinks that way, because this episode is for you. It's for the 60% of doctors who struggle with imposter syndrome. And I want to share some recent insights that I've had after that talk at the mastermind event in Austin, and some other thoughts that I've thought about in this arena of imposter syndrome for a really long time, because the root of my imposter syndrome comes simply from this. I don't think very highly of myself, and I never really have. And every time I mention this publicly, people were like, oh, wow, Jimmy, I had no idea. Like, you seem like a really confident person. And I don't want you to confuse imposter syndrome or having a low view of myself, a low self-confidence, with confidence. Because I've never lacked confidence. I can look back at the hundreds of times I've spoken publicly and draw from those experiences and know that I'm probably going to give a great talk when I stand up in front of people. And that's built on confidence, which is based on the fact that I've done something before. Though, to be honest with you, that isn't always true. I actually recently gave a new version of a talk, and I'm learning from it, right? It didn't land as well as I wanted it to. That doesn't mean that it wasn't good. But at the same time, like, it definitely could have been better. It's part of the process, But if I'm being honest, I've always had a low view of myself internally. So that's self-confidence. It's very different than confidence, which draws upon your experiences and knowing that you've done something 1,000 times. Self-confidence is, how confident are you in yourself, in your inherent abilities, your inherent skills, talents, characteristics? And we talk about me being a hard master on myself. In fact, we talked about this in episode 21 when we discussed choosing curiosity over shame, where I talk about that Henry Ward Beecher quote that used to sit above my desk in residency, the quote about, being lenient on everyone else and a hard master on yourself. And that's been the story of my life for 36 years. So you may be asking, though, like, what exactly is imposter syndrome? And maybe I should have led with this, right? According to, the source of all knowledge and wisdom, Wikipedia, I'm going to read this now. Imposter syndrome is defined this way. Imposter syndrome, also known as imposter phenomenon, impostricism, fraud syndrome, or the imposter experience, is a psychological pattern in which an individual doubts their skills, talents, or accomplishments and has a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud, a quote-unquote fraud. And I'm not going to lie, this is me to a T. While everyone else may have thought I was doing great things, I felt like I was somehow going to mess it up and make this all go away. That the success I've had in my business, the success I've had in medicine, that was just going to go away. And then everyone else would know what I knew, which is that I can be a raging dumpster fire internally. And that's true to this day. Like, I still struggle with, many a things. It's part of the human experience, but sometimes I don't remember that. Because the way that I dealt with my imposter syndrome for a long time is to do what we're all told in medicine. I bet you do it too. Fake it till you make it. I'm surely not the only one who has ever heard that phrase, fake it until you make it. And this method tells us to kind of put on a mask and to pretend like we're there. And that if we convince ourselves and convince everyone else we're good enough, maybe we can convince ourselves too, right? This problem, of course, is that it doesn't work. You can't outrun internal work of figuring out who and what you are. And this is what I did for a really long time. I tried to outrun the internal work of figuring out who I am and what I am and believing in that by accomplishing. Because accomplishments produce confidence. But skipping that internal work means that your self-confidence never improves, right? And so it's important that we don't try to outrun that internal work of figuring out who we are, what we stand up for. What do we want in this life? What do you want? And honestly, that's been one of the toughest questions for me to answer over the last couple of years. When my coach, my amazing coach, Trisha, she's awesome. Trisha asks me, like, what do I want? Jimmy, what do you want? And I'm not going to lie to you, for a really long time, I've had a just super hard time answering that question, honestly. I don't know what I want because for a large part of my life, I didn't really know who I am because I spent most of my life as a people pleaser. We've also discussed that on this show. People pleasing. Go check it out. And self-confidence really comes from this internal work. And self-confidence is knowing who and what we are internally, regardless of what we have done externally. Are we a burned out hot mess? Or are you the badass boss of your life? Are we a good spouse or parent? Or are we a complete train wreck at home? What story are we telling ourselves when no one else is listening? This is what matters. This is the internal work. Who we know we are is the antidote to any imposter syndrome we might have. So let's look at a few tools you might use to defeat imposter syndrome if this is, a beast that you're trying to slay in your life, like it is in mine. So first, we can choose self-compassion. Now, compassion comes from two words, calm, which means with, and pati, P-A-T-I, which means to suffer. That's why compassion is often defined as to suffer with. Now, most people use this word compassion and they kind of deflect it externally because it's to suffer with someone else. But it can also be an internal process as well. And when we do this, it's called self-compassion. Dr. Kristen Neff, a psychologist, researcher, author of the book, same title, Self-Compassion, argues that self-compassion has three parts. It includes self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. And we often talk about common humanity on the show, right? That you're a human having a human experience. When things don't go the way that you think that they are going to, and you get surprised, you're overwhelmed, you're anxious, you get a $22,000 tax bill from your accountant when you expect it to be more like 5 or 10. This is me living in my common humanity, doing bad math and not taking as close of an intentional look at my bill each month, my tax bill each month or each quarter, right? That's just me having a human experience. I know I'm not the only person on the show who has had a larger than they expected tax bill to come out. I'm living in my common humanity there, right? Self-kindness, on the other hand, is an ability to look at ourselves in an objective third-person perspective. It is a skill that you can employ when you drink one more beer than you should, right? After a tough day. Or when you raise your voice at your kids after the 13th time they've asked you to buy them a cell phone or an iPod. yes, these are both personal examples. And so how can we employ this kind of self-kindness where we have self-compassion, we suffer with ourselves, we are kind to ourselves, and there are a few ways. One way is to ask ourselves a really simple question, and this is really helpful for me a lot of times. So if someone else was going through the same thing that I'm going through right now, what would I say to them? Right? And we could try to employ the external compassion we often offer to other people, and then in turn offer it to ourselves. For example, when I recently gave a talk on burnout with a new format, the one that I was alluding to earlier, it didn't land as well as I would have liked it. I could choose to look at that talk and be like, man, what a failure. That was a terrible talk. I cannot believe that happened. Or, I could beat myself up like that. Or I could say, I wonder what someone would say to me if I told them I tried a new talk with new ideas and it needed some work after the first time that I gave it. They'd probably be like, hey, bro, it was your first talk. Looking back when your talk is finally amazing, you're going to remember this first time and what you've learned from it, right? And this isn't to discount the fact that I still had people come up to me after the talk and be like, Jimmy, that really resonated with me. I'm really interested in coaching now after hearing you talk about the impact it's had on your life, because it was a talk on burnout and on coaching. And so that totally happened, but I was just beating myself up for it, right? But when I stepped back and asked myself, like, what would someone else say to me about a talk that was imperfect, that I was giving for the first time? And that's it. They would say, hey, dude, it's your first talk. Don't sweat it. It's going to get better. And when we externalize this conversation, we can often see how we're beating ourselves up. This can help us deal with that negative self-talk we often have that leads to our imposter syndrome, that leads to us feeling like a fraud, that we're not as good as we want to be, and that negative self-talk. Now, I'd already figured that piece out, but it wasn't until the talk that I referenced earlier by Rachel Hart at this conference that I learned there was another way to externalize this concept. And it's kind of a hybrid approach. It's an external-internal combo that I could use to think of ways to defeat my imposter syndrome. Because before Rachel's talk, I would talk about my accomplishments and dismiss them. Part of imposter syndrome is not taking credit for the things that you've done. So, for example, I would say things like, I got into medical school because, this one person got me an interview. Or, well, my business has been successful because I'm the only male physician coach with a large audience, which today, still remains true from certification from the life coach school, right? And so, yeah, that's the reason why I'm successful. But when other people find the other male physician coaches out there who are amazing, everything's going to change. Like I'm totally gonna, it's just not going to work. As if all of this is an accident. I can't accept responsibility for what I've done, what I've created. At every turn, I discount and dismiss and discredit my success, because if I don't, I'd have to actually admit that I'm not as bad as I think I am internally. I'd actually have to deal with the possibility that I might like myself, that I might be proud of the things that I've done. And that's where Rachel's talk came in. Rachel Hart told us that if you suffer from imposter syndrome and you find yourself discounting or dismissing your accomplishments, to imagine talking to a younger version of yourself. In fact, she said, why don't you print off some pictures, put it in front of your desk, and I might do this. I might put this up in front of this camera and podcast mic that I'm speaking into right now, and put some pictures up of myself. And of when I was 8 or 10 years old, or maybe when I was 15 or 20, I was finishing college, right? And looking into the eyes of those pictures and trying to tell my younger self that what they have accomplished isn't worthwhile, that they're just a fake, they're a fraud, that what they have done doesn't make anything worth it. And when she said it like that and put those pictures of herself up on the screen, I was like, man, I thought about my kids. I could never tell Wesley, my 8-year-old, or Grace, who's about to be 11 this week as I record this, I could never tell them that what they're accomplishing isn't their own accomplishment, that they're a fraud, that they haven't made it, that what they're doing doesn't matter. And when I look at those pictures of a younger version of myself or a younger version of Rachel as she gave this talk, I'm not going to lie to you, man, that it just crushed me. What if all this success that I've created isn't luck? What if this business isn't a fluke? What if all of the accomplishments I've made weren't just fortunate happenstance, but were a result of me being a total badass? What if I didn't have to hide my imposter syndrome with humility, which is what I often do? I discredit myself and give credit to everyone else so that I don't have to deal with the fact that maybe I'm not a fraud. So when you're listening to this and you've done a successful surgery, right? Do we give ourselves as much credit for that successful surgery as we do when things don't go well? When you have that tough patient in clinic that you break down their barriers and make change in their life, do you give yourself as much credit as the ones where it's a really hard day? You get that bad patient review. Or do we count those negative experiences as twice as, much, as weighing twice as much or having twice as much impact as the positive experiences we have? Those positive experiences that we have aren't a fluke. They're not an accident. They're not happenstance. You created that. And when I thought about it this way, it immediately changed everything for me. Because I couldn't look back and tell the 10 or 15 or 20-year-old version of myself that what I've accomplished wasn't enough. Or even the 35-year-old version of myself, that wasn't enough, that this business I've created and the work that I've done in medicine and the research and the teaching and the clinical care, that's not enough, that I got to keep accomplishing because I'm a fraud, that I needed to accomplish more in order to be lovable or worthy. That's why after the talk was done, I went up to Rachel for her talk and I immediately lost it. She had a grown-ass physician man standing in front of her crying, right? And I just wanted to say thanks, honestly. But her talk had, really shaken me to my core, because I never realized until that moment that my struggle with imposter syndrome and my inability or lack of desire to deal with it comes from the fact that as a 36-year-old man, I don't always know what I want. I don't always know who I am. And that by dealing with this imposter syndrome, I'd actually have to get to know that person, that internal work that I decided to skip for the first 35 years of my life. I'd have to combat with that. And I'd have to look back at the younger versions of myself and declare that those things were things that I built, that I earned, that I own. And as someone standing in front of this woman, I felt very bad for her because, she's got this male physician, like ugly crying in front of her, like embarrassing style crying. And you know what? It felt great. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have to be ashamed that I'm a passionate guy. I cry more than my wife does. If you ever meet us in person, it is very evident. My wife makes fun of me for crying during commercials, and I'm saying that right now to thousands of people listening on this podcast. So it is what it is. That's who I am, and I'm no longer ashamed to share that. I'm no longer ashamed to admit that I'm a passionate guy, that this is the way that I'm wired. And I was taking my first step in thanking her, and honestly, in crying in front of her, to owning that, to being who I am. Like, I'm not going to apologize for that anymore. And so, this journey from imposter syndrome to being the hero of your story, the hero of your life, it's not an easy one. And it's not easy telling you this right now on this microphone, right? Speaking of that, for anyone that's followed me for a really long time, this kind of reminds me of the Ben Rector song, Heroes. So he's got this new song come out. It's on his new album, The Joy of Music, and we're actually going to be seeing Ben Rector live in Charlotte in a couple months after this podcast goes live, this episode goes live. So when the song came out, he has this new song on it. It's called Heroes. Like, I loved it from the jump. This song is all about how the people we look up to our lives when we were younger are like heroes to us. And I remember this. Like, this is like, I just remember these transitions in my life. Like, when I was a freshman on my high school team, my high school soccer team, or my college soccer team. So I was a college goalkeeper in a Division II school, small school called Erskine. You've never heard of it. It's okay. No one has it either. Maybe some of you have listened to this, but I was a goalkeeper, and I looked up and like there were these senior goalkeepers that were on the team. They're incredible. And I looked at them like, man, like these guys are just amazing. Or, being a young person who became a believer, Christian, in my junior year in high school, and looking back at that and like looking at other people that were further along in their faith, more senior in their faith, and thinking like, wow, like these people are incredible, or a best friend's mom or dad, like whoever your heroes were growing up, right? And thinking I could never be that person. Like I could never be the hero like they are. And yet, like all heroes, there comes a point where we realize with a sudden dose of like massive reality that all of these heroes are human. We may see them make mistakes. We may see them fail. They may fall flat on their face, sometimes in the most unbelievable ways. And sometimes it's just a matter of the fact that like we grew up and all of a sudden we're the senior on the soccer team, right? We're the person that people come to for advice. And after some time, that's exactly what happens. You're the leader. You're the captain of the team. or you're the mom or dad leading the way. And at some point, we have to let go of the image that being the hero, and more importantly, the idea that we even need to be a hero or that we need a hero. We don't need a hero. You know why? Because you are the hero of your own story. You don't have to feel like a fraud. You can feel like a hero. And you can feel like the person that is owning your story, living your life, and is responsible for the outcomes that you have. And we talk about how important that is when it comes to burnout for burned out doctors in terms of victim blaming. And this is a completely different episode. I'm not going to go into it. Maybe I should, because this has been coming up a lot more recently again. But, this idea of like people not liking the term burnout. And talking off the cuff here, one reason why I do like the term burnout is because I'm going to be honest with you. The system is broken. It needs to be fixed. But that is not mutually exclusive with doctors having the ability to help themselves. And no one who has ever declared themselves a victim of burnout or imposter syndrome has ever changed their life. That's not something that happens. And so does medicine exploit us? Possibly. Is moral injury a thing? Absolutely. Do those things cause the individual phenomenon of burnout? 100%. But that doesn't mean that you are not able to stand up and make the change that you need in your life to become the hero of your story. Now, you're going to fight me on this because I used to fight it all the time. I remember being asked this question in the past and getting so mad that people would blame the victims of burnout because it's not their fault. But I just want to say you have the choice to become the hero of your story, to refuse to let someone else burn you out. And I know that sounds strange, and it's going to offend a lot of people. I'm okay with that because I'm stepping into who and what I am, right? You do not need to be rescued, my friend. You are not an imposter in your life. And if you're listening to this podcast right now, you have graduated from college, you've graduated from medical school. Odds are you've graduated from residency and fellowship too. And at the very least, you are a highly accomplished medical professional. And this brings me to my last tip on dealing with imposter syndrome. If you are ever doubting yourself, I highly encourage you to consider what someone else might say to you. I highly encourage you to look back on your accomplishments and to own them. You created that. And I love the idea that Rachel proposed about talking to a younger version of ourselves if we're having trouble with that. Would you look back into the eyes of your 10-year-old self, 15-year-old self, and say that they're a fake, they're a fraud, that what they're doing doesn't matter, that they haven't accomplished anything? And if not, why are you talking to yourself like that? Why do you discredit your success and take all of the blame? A more tangible way that I deal with imposter syndrome, though, is to think about this simple fact. You are already a hero in someone else's eyes. It may be your kid. It could be your audience if you're an online entrepreneur, right? There's a good chance one of your patients thinks that you're the cat's pajamas too, by the way. Someone in your life is your biggest fan. And even on your worst day, someone looks up to you. So as we round out this show, I want you to think about what would you say to someone else? I want you to think about talking to your past self. But I also want you to consider, what would your favorite fan, your biggest fan, say to you? I bet they would tell you that you're awesome. I bet that they would tell you that you've changed their life. You know why? Because you are. And you need to reconcile with that. You need to own it. You are the hero of someone else's story. So why not be the hero of your own? So if you're a physician struggling with imposter syndrome, I hope that this show helped normalize your experience. You aren't alone. I suffer with it too. But you are somebody else's hero. If you ever feel like a fraud or don't love yourself, consider what you might say to someone else in that same situation. Consider what you might say to a younger version of yourself. And if that doesn't work, close your eyes, picture your biggest fan, whoever that might be, and imagine what they might say to you, because you're not an imposter. You are not a fraud. You are an amazing, awesome, and heroic physician. All right, so if you are a physician who feels burned out in medicine and you want to learn how to create the personal and financial freedom to make medicine optional, make sure to schedule a consult with one of our coaches by visiting thephysicianphilosopher.com/consult. Imposter syndrome is one of those things. It just takes work, right? I'm working on this myself with my own coach. And yes, coaches have coaches because we're human too. And so I want you to know you're not alone, that there's help out there, that it exists, and that you can be and already are the hero of your story and of many others. So today's thought is this. If you feel like a fraud, remember that you are the hero of someone else's story. Until next time, my friends, start before you're ready. Start by starting. Start now. I will see you next week.